Welcome to the UP Notable Books Club, brought to you by the Upper Peninsula Publisher and Authors Association. Maryka Biaggio is a psychology professor turned novelist who specializes in historical fiction based on real people. A graduate from Marquette High School and Northern Michigan University, she enjoys the challenge of starting with actual figures and dramatizing their lives, figuring out what motivated them to behave as they did, studying how the cultural and historical context may have influenced them, and recreating a sense of their emotional world through dialogue and action. She is an avid opera fan and enjoys gardening, art films, and of course great fiction. She lives in Portland, Oregon.
And my name is Evelyn Gasu, and I am the director here at the Crystal Falls District Community Library. And I sure hope if any of you are in our area that you stop in sometime. I know a few of you have, and it's been so neat to see you Zoom personalities for real. It's kind of fun. So anyway, before we get started with tonight's speaker, I'm going to hand it over to Victor like I always do. He is the president of UPPAA, the Upper Peninsula Publishers and Authors Association, and he usually has some news for us about something. So Victor, what can you tell us?
I do. What you should see right now is a picture of the UP Reader. We are coming down the home stretch for volume 6 of the UP Reader, featuring more than 30 articles from writers around the UP. All of them are UPPAA members. And if you want to join us at UPPAA, you can submit your work and be featured in the next UP Reader. But the most exciting part for me is that we feature the winners of the Dandelion Cottage Contest. Now, what is that? That is a contest that any student in the UP grades 5 through 12 can submit their short story.
I should subscribe to UP Reader.
You should.
Oh, sorry.
And, a series of judges will evaluate, and I'm one of the judges. I enjoy reading all the stories, and I get really excited when the stories I want win. So I think this is going to be a great issue. Anyway, I would like to invite all of you to participate in our spring conference, which is coming up in the lovely city of Marquette in the Peter White Library on June the 4th, 2022. You can join us, UPPAA, as a member, or you don't have to join. You pay a little more as a non-member. We'll have the Linda Lagarde Grover, who's with us tonight. She'll be speaking as a keynote. And we have 6 different breakout speakers. We'll be talking about all kinds of writing, poetry, children's books, fiction, nonfiction, whatever you're into. You'll find it at the UPPAA Spring Conference coming up in June 2022. All right, thank you, Evelyn.
Well, you're welcome, Victor. And speaking of Michael Klassen, whose cover we just saw on the new UP Reader, he is who we are reading next month. So our next book is called Points North. And if you don't have this book, you might even want to buy this one. It's got all kinds of neat, it's really neat because it's, as you can see, color pictures along with text, and it goes through all different places in the UP that you might want to visit or take company to go and visit. So it's a good time of year to I think I kind of planned to have this book for April because I know a lot of us like to kind of plan our summer vacations. So I think you'll enjoy reading this one, our April book. And without any and I hope you all noticed I used my new email. So we've switched over here. So it's now egathu@crystalfallslibrary.org. So, and soon, hopefully this month, we're going to switch over how I email you to using MailChimp, which Victor talked to me about. So we're in the process of making that switch too. Mary has a question. Mary.
Oh, I just wanted to say I've started reading that next book, and it is very detailed, down to the specifics about, well, this is hard to find, but it's really worth getting there and how to get there. And it's just fascinating. And I think everybody will love it because you'll be able to, like you said, plan your summer and everything in the UP.
Yeah. Well, thanks for that, Mary. I'm glad you always read a little bit quicker than me, and I'm glad.
Oh, I like to get ahead so that I don't compete with other people for the book.
Yes, and that's very nice of you. And speaking of books, like I was telling Victor, some of you who got on a little bit late might not have heard this, but we have year 3 almost cemented. So we've got 8 of the 10 UP notable books for year 3. 8 of the 10 authors have committed to doing a Zoom talk. So we will be running these Zoom talks now through next January, through January of 2023. So that's really exciting. And, you know, it takes a little time because we want to make sure we get the books in the right months. You know, I try to put shorter books, like say in the month of December, and, you know, try to keep everybody's needs met because certain times of year are more busy than others. And some of you are muted, which is great while we have our talk. And some of you may want to mute while Maryka is speaking to us. But I'm going to introduce to you now Maryka Biaggio. Did I say it right?
You did.
Ah, good. And she is the author of 2 books, correct?
3, soon to be 4.
Oh, 3. Okay. Well, that's a good place to start because I know about this one. When last year, when I first contacted Maryka about Eden Waits and doing a Zoom, she said, buy this book, you know, your patrons will like it. And they have. It's gone out like 6 times, which is pretty good around here. So I think you might, if you enjoyed Eden Waits, you'd probably like Parlor Games. And I don't have Eden Waits to show. Maybe someone there can hold it up in the audience, because somebody checked it out again here from the library. So, and then maybe that's a good place for you to start, Maryka, if you want to tell us about your other book 3 and book 4.
Okay. Yeah, my 3rd novel is called The Point of Vanishing, and it came out last year. And I have another book coming out on March 29th called The Model Spy, based on the true story of a woman who spied for the Italian resistance and the Allies during World War II.
Great. Well,
but tonight,
I'm going to order them.
I'm happy to talk to you tonight about Eden Waits. So I have a slideshow that I'm going to call up. If I can find it here. I had it here just a minute ago. It's coming up. There we go. So I'd like to talk a little bit about the times, the place, the people, and a little bit about my research for Eden Waits. And then I'll be happy to take questions that any of you may have about Eden Waits or the other matters that I'm going to be talking about. So Eden Waits is based on the true story of a utopian community that was founded in the Upper Peninsula of Michigan in the 1890s. The founders were Abraham and Elizabeth Byers. Abraham was born in 1829 in Ohio, and he married Henrietta. They had 5 children, 3 of whom survived to adulthood. Henrietta died in 1861, and Abraham was left with his children, which may be why he did not serve in the Civil War. He was an itinerant preacher and the force behind Eden Waits. His wife, Elizabeth Kepler Byers, was a Civil War widow. She lost her husband after only about her first husband after only 3 months. They were married 3 months before he went away and died in one of the early battles of the Civil War. So Elizabeth and Abraham married around 1864, just as the Civil War was wrapping up, and they had 4 boys. And she was really a very important figure in the Byers settlement. In fact, some say that she was the one that was responsible for her family and her relatives and the children of both her and Abraham's first wife, all moving up to the UP to start the Byers settlement. So Abraham and Elizabeth, after they were first married, settled in the southwest corner of Michigan, not too far away from Chicago. And apparently Abraham preached on some of the streets of Chicago, but he quickly tired of that. So in 1882, there was a homestead opening of lands in the Upper Peninsula, and Elizabeth urged Abraham to consider moving there and homesteading some land. So between the two of them, they convinced 9 others to homestead 160-acre lots up in the UP. And this was in the township of Hiawatha, right outside of Manistee, Michigan, in what is now the Hiawatha Forest. So all 4 of Abraham and Elizabeth's sons and Abraham's 2 sons by his first marriage, as well as some of Elizabeth's brothers, homesteaded some land up there. 8 of them, 8 parties, proved up the land. They had to and stay on the land for 5 years, building housing on it in order to prove up their homestead. So after those 5 years, 8 parties had proved up and therefore earned the deeds to their 160-acre lots. So there were a total of 1,280 acres in what came to be known as the Byers settlement. And around that time, after everybody proved up lots, Abraham secured a deed for a cemetery in the settlement, and many people who lived in the settlement are buried in this cemetery, including Abraham and Elizabeth Byers. So this was an interesting time in the country's history. The 1870s and 1880s saw the greatest industrial boom that the country had ever seen. In fact, it was the greatest industrial boom the world had ever seen. And a lot of industry really just blossomed during this period, notably the rail industry, the steel industry, mining, and so on. And it was also the period of the robber barons, that is, powerful industrialists who really became quite wealthy through the monopolies that they formed in their particular industries. However, the flip side of this was that there was a fair amount of exploitation and of workers, and not much in the way of workers' rights. No work week, no disability, none of the protections that we now associate with the union movement and so on. So what happened during this period is that the discontent gave rise to a lot to third parties, and the Populist Party, probably the most popular of them, was formed around 1892. And the Populists ran James B. Weaver in the 1982 presidential election. Unfortunately, he only garnered about 8% of the vote, and this was a source of quite a bit of discontent among a lot of working people, and we saw a lot of unrest during this period. But then this was followed fast on the heels of the 1892 election, was the Panic of 1893. A couple of really large corporations in the US, the Philadelphia and Reading Railroad and the National Cordage Company went under. What had happened during the boom of the 70s and the 80s is that many businesses overexpanded or expanded really quickly and borrowed heavily and became very much in debt. So in 1893, when these two big companies foundered, it led to a panic. Banks started calling in loans, other businesses failed, and there was just a cascade of bankruptcies. Many banks failed, leaving people without their money. Unemployment soared during this depression. It was a 4-year depression. The unemployment rate was as high as 25% at some time, at some periods during this. It was the worst depression that the US had ever seen and continued for 4 years. Now, many companies went under, and those that didn't were struggling quite a bit. And this, of course, included the workers of the Upper Peninsula. The companies there cut wages, as was happening across the country. A lot of people lost jobs. There was just this incredible contraction that led to a lot of suffering. So the UP at that time was really, logging was the main industry. And there was so much logging going on in the UP that it was really providing a lot of lumber for the building that was the building boom that had gone on up until the Great Depression. In fact, it's said that after the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, it was lumber from the UP that largely went to the rebuilding of Chicago. Now, a lot of people were employed in the lumbering industry in the Upper Peninsula. And the Chicago Lumbering Company had quite a large yard in Manistee. It was probably the largest of all the lumber companies. And there were quite a few in the UP at that time. But Manistee was basically a company town. The Chicago Lumbering Company ran a commissary store. They rented housing to the workers and their families. So they really had a hold on the whole city of Manistee. So that even to the extent that several people who were living in the buyer's settlement were employed by the Chicago Lumbering Company. They did, of course, hunt and fish and start gardens and orchards in the buyer's settlement, but still some of them needed an income outside of this and ended up working with the Chicago Lumbering Company. So when the panic hit, they saw their wages shrink, sometimes their hours increase, and the squeeze was really on. And a lot of people in Manistee were impoverished during this time and really struggling. So Abraham had an idea. He was of course very concerned about not only his relatives on the settlement, but the workers of the Chicago Lumbering Company. He was a populist. He had stumped for the Populist Party. He was very much a political man in addition to being a preacher. And about this time, he stumbled on a book called The Product Sharing Village. This is a book authored by Walter Thomas Mills, who was a fellow third partier. And in his book, he proposed a kind of self-sufficient community scheme whereby a group of people would come together on a plot of land, and they would farm this land and create their own industry on this land to the point where they could become self-sufficient and wouldn't necessarily need outside employment. So Abraham became quite enchanted with this whole notion of a product sharing village. And after reading Walter Thomas Mill's book, he corresponded with Mills, who was residing in Chicago, and invited Mills up to the buyer's settlement. And to his surprise, Mills consented and traveled up there. He gave a series of lectures in Manistee, which were very well received and covered by the press. And together, Walter Thomas Mills and Abraham Byers decided that they would make of the buyer's settlement a product sharing village. They would model it after Walter Thomas Mill's book. So they started publicizing their project. They gave talks in and around Manistee. Mills went back down to Chicago and gave some talks and started traveling around and talking up this community. It was publicized in the newsletter put out by the Populist Party, and they invited people to come and join the settlement. It attracted quite a lot of attention. People from as far away as Texas journeyed to the UP. They had to pay an admission in order to join the settlement, or they had to contribute goods such as livestock or something. So in this way, the settlement grew some capital. And while they were doing this, they were working on getting the settlement incorporated into this new entity called Hiawatha Colony. Abraham and Walter convinced all of the people who owned acreage in the settlement to deed it to the settlement. So this is just a look at the land as it is now. It's right off of M94, beside out of Manistee. And this is one of the buildings, one of the colony houses, but there are no longer any buildings of the original, from the original settlement there now. But this is the land, one of the deeds that was sold over to the settlement by Alva Kepler, who was one of Elizabeth Kepler's brothers. So they all deeded their land to the Hiawatha Village Association, which was the name for the incorporated community. It also was called Hiawatha Colony. So thus began this experiment in a self-sufficient community. At its peak, the colony had about 200 people in it. They built a large barn. They bought additional equipment for milling lumber. They cleared more land. They planted more orchards, and they consolidated all the housing in a central area. And this led to some discontent because everybody, the original settlers, lived at far-flung places across this 1,280 acres. So they all had a fair amount of privacy and autonomy. But according to Walter Thomas Mill's plan, all of the settlers were supposed to live in a village in the middle so that they could work in their at their little manufacturing jobs, which they started doing, making gloves from deer hide and other sorts of industries. And not all the members of the colony were happy about this, especially two of Elizabeth's family members. Her brother, John Kepler, and his wife, Elvilla, as well as her brother, Alva, were skeptical from the beginning, and they felt like they had somewhat been railroaded into this arrangement. But when they were told that they had to leave the cabins that they had built and come and live in the central village, then a lot of tension developed within the community. And I don't know if everybody has read the book. I don't necessarily want to give away the ending, but suffice it to say that there was a fair amount of internal strife as well as external pressure on the community. The Chicago Lumbering Company was not happy about this settlement because they saw them as a competitor. Because they wanted to do their own lumbering and they wanted to do their own manufacturing, and this took away from the commissary, and it put pressure on the workers in terms of them offering more benefits to the workers and so on. So the Chicago Lumbering Company was dead set against this, and Abraham had never endeared himself to them anyway with his political activities. So there is one building still in existence from the original settlement, and this is Alva Kepler's cabin. It was disassembled and moved to Manistee, where it sits now in Pioneer Park. And I think they open it up when they do Pioneer Days in Manistee, but you can see this. It was obviously a really well-built cabin, and I think everybody who lived in the settlement really took pride in what they had done in the early part of the early years of the settlement. So just a little bit about the research. My primary source for doing research on the Eden Waits was a scholarly book by Olive Anderson called Utopia in Upper Michigan. She published this in the early 1980s through the through Northern Michigan University Press in Marquette. And she was able to interview quite a few people, descendants of people who had lived in the community. She was able to track down some of the letters that had been written by original members of the settlement, and dug up newspaper accounts. So she did a really good job on her research, and this is a very well-researched book if you're interested in the scholarly background of this. And this copy, my copy of this book, was given to me by my mother, because we happen to be descendants of Abraham and Elizabeth Byers. They are my great grandparents. And Elizabeth actually lived until 1933. So my mother and my grandmother knew Elizabeth and told me a little bit about her. So the story was kind of passed down through my family, and this book was passed on to me. And I was able to go to the Historical Society in Marquette County, because Olive Anderson, before she died, she willed all of her research materials to the Marquette County Historical Society. So I was able to go through all of her original materials, which were just amazing to see, you know, the newspaper reports of the period, what they said about this community, how much interest it really had not just in Manistee, but in the whole UP and in some farther away parts too. It got write-ups. So it was really, all of this was really helpful to me in researching the community. It took me a couple of years to write Eden Waits. And the cover that you see here is a photograph taken by Brenda Weber, a cousin of mine who lives in Manistee, and it's right, this is a picture taken right outside of Manistee. It's not the property per se, but you all know what winter looks like in the UP and what the people in the settlement and the Hiawatha colony had to struggle against in the winters. So I'll just close with a brief note about a review of the novel by the Michigan in Books Review. And I also wanted to mention the novel that Evelyn brought up earlier on, Parlor Games, is also about somebody from the UP. It's based on the true story of May Dugas, who was born in Menominee, Michigan. And she actually went on to travel the world and became quite well known to the Pinkerton detectives because she had a habit of trying to separate wealthy men from their money. So if any of you are interested in another book about a UP personage, I can recommend Parlor Games. Now, I'd be happy to take any questions that you may have about Eden Waits or the writing of it.
Eileen has a question. Do you want to start, Eileen? You have to unmute yourself. Oh, nope, we'll come back to Eileen. Anybody else have a question? I have one while we're waiting. Like I wrote today in the email, I could really picture your book well in my mind, like a movie. And I had all these different Hollywood people as stars. They didn't look anything like those pictures at all.
Yeah.
And they should have, really, your pictures. I mean, I don't know why when you showed them, I was like, oh, wow. I really saw them a little bit differently, but I thought that was kind of neat. One thing I kind of wanted to ask, when I read the book, it seemed to me, and maybe because you wrote it, you can help me with this one. It seemed like the colony kind of soured really fast, or was that just the way the book kind of portrayed it? Did it last a little bit longer? You know, because there was the jam incident, and then with the other people having to move away from their log homes.
I actually tried to really stay true to the actual timeline and the actual incidents.
Okay.
The blueberry jam incident debacle really happened. And the timeline that the community was founded happened, and the way it came to its demise really happened according to the timeline. So I really did want to be true to the actual events. You know, what's really obviously made up are the conversations and some of the minutia of daily life, but I really didn't want to go out on a limb and do anything that was out of the bounds of what was realistically could have happened in the community. I wanted it to ring true.
Okay, thank you. Anybody else? I'm sure we have some more questions out there in the audience. Victor.
All right, it seemed like the real downfall was when the sorry, I can't forget the name. I'll call him the cult leader, you know, insisted on getting the best house and moving the other people into the cheap, unfinished buildings. Does that sound right?
I think that that was a part of it. I think there were a number of factors really that converged that led to the demise of the community. It is true that Walter Thomas Mills expected preferential treatment. I mean, he was a wealthy man. He lived on the north side of Chicago. His wife was so accustomed to the life of leisure that she refused to move to the Upper Peninsula. She stayed behind in Chicago while Walter Thomas Mills moved up to the settlement. So the preferential treatment that he expected rubbed a lot of people in the settlement the wrong way. But I think, you know, probably the single most important event was the arrest of Walter Thomas Mills and a couple of people who helped him forcibly remove John and Elvilla Kepler from their cabin. They were charged with assault, and they were convicted and fined for assault. And I think that at this point, Abraham really decided that he could no longer countenance Walter Thomas Mills' forcible attempts to force his rules on the rest of the community. So I think that was probably the event that led to the break, because they had to pay fines. They had to agree to give back land that, for instance, John and Elvilla wanted to move back to their original cabin and have their land and not be a part of the community. So the Hiawatha Corporation had to go ahead and release them to do that. And that was the end of the Hiawatha colony.
Thank you.
Somebody asks how they came up with the name Hiawatha. I think actually that this was Abraham's idea. The term may have been in use in the Upper Peninsula already, but he decided to use it for the colony to honor the Native Americans that had lived in that area.
You've written now, so you've written 4 books. I really wish Deborah K. Frontera was on tonight, because she's a historical fiction writer here in the UP. And I've read some of her work, and she said writing historical fiction, to write it well, is like the hardest thing compared to other types of writing. How did you find writing this book compared to your other books?
Yeah, I do write historical fiction exclusively. And I see somebody else has asked in the chat, they're curious about my writing process and how I became a writer. I didn't start out as a writer. I started out as a professor of psychology. I worked at universities for about 30 years, but I always wanted to write. So I decided around the year 2000 that I was going to write. And what gave me the idea was I wanted to write about my grandfather on my father's side, who came over from Switzerland and spent 8 years in New York before he ended up in Chicago, and nobody knew what he did when he lived in New York. So I decided to make up a story about what he did when he lived in Chicago. So that was the very first novel I wrote. And then I wrote Eden Waits after that. But I think writing historical fiction has an extra challenge over and beyond writing fiction set in the contemporary period, because we're all immersed in the contemporary period. We know how to write about the day-to-day life of our contemporary time. We know what people wear, we know their habits, we know what they eat, and so on. But when you're writing historical fiction, you have to go back and study the times. You have to know about what clothing people wore. You have to know what they ate. You have to know about the values and mores of the time. You have to know about the conflicts that they lived with. You can't just take modern day people and transport them back, because you have to be true to the values and the mores of people of the time periods that you're writing in. So I think it is more of a challenge to write historical fiction. And what I have done that has helped me to get into the time periods is reading novels that were written contemporaneous to the period that I'm working in, reading newspaper articles, reading biographies, reading letters if I can get a hold of them. All of these things have helped me to get a feel for the time period. And I pride myself on taking that very seriously. And my mother, when she read, she was able to read Eden Waits before she died. I was glad that I was able to share that with her. But after she read it, she said to me, "Maryka, how did you know that Abraham sounded like that?" Well, the thing is, I didn't really know how Abraham sounded. I didn't know about his character, but I had to try from what I read in newspapers about him and what I read in Olive Anderson's account and the letters that came down that were written by other people about him. I had to make my best guess. And I think Abraham was obviously a preacher and had strong beliefs. So I just put all that together and I imagined what I thought Abraham sounded like. And I gave him, you know, these sermons, and I gave him this certain way of talking. So, you know, my mother felt that it was so real that it was like him, but neither one of us knew really, you know, how Abraham talked. So it's my best guess based on what I have learned about him through documents.
You know, not everyone heard this at the beginning, but you don't live in the Upper Peninsula. You're Skyping us from what? Tell us again.
I'm in Portland, Oregon now, but I grew up in the Midwest. I was born in Chicago. My family lived in Manistee for a short period of time when I was quite young. And then we moved back to Marquette when I was in high school. So I graduated from Marquette High and I went to Northern Michigan. So I'm a graduate of Marquette High and NMU. So, and I go back to the UP every now and then to visit. I love the UP.
Does your historical fiction writing make you travel? Like, do you do trips to kind of get certain things right, or?
I have, yes. In fact, I was recently in France because I've written a novel that's based in the medieval period of France. So I had to go to Paris and the environs of Paris to do a little research on that.
Wow, that's neat.
So yeah, I do sometimes travel to the sites of my novels.
Great. Do we have any other comments or questions or things people want to ask or share?
I'd like to share my opinion, first of all, about your book. I read the book 2 years ago to be reviewed on the website Victor started for the UP books, and I was fascinated with it. I thought you did an excellent job with drawing up the characters and writing their dialogue, which you just mentioned about how did you know how they sound? Well, I'm also a historical fiction writer, so I understand your challenge. And I want to say that I also appreciated that it was a rather gentle story. It was a story that had a religious element, which I'm a very ardent Christian. So, of course, when I read a book, I don't want to be offended by a lot of things that are in a lot of the historical novels that are put out for the secular public. So I appreciated that it had this religious element, but I also appreciated how skillfully you drew up the conflict, and then you had to create a turnaround in your character's view of what was going on. And you did that without sounding like it was out of character. So you brought that story to the point where, okay,
this is the breaking point, things have to change. And the characters had to accept that that was what was going to happen. The change was going to come. So congratulations on a great book. I really enjoyed reading it and writing the review.
Thank you. Yeah, I appreciated your review. It was wonderful. Yeah, I think one of the most touching parts of the whole process of writing the novel for me was the relationship between Abraham and Elizabeth, because, you know, they really had different perspectives on community. Abraham was much more political. He brought his politics into his daily life. And Elizabeth was really more quiet, and she was the one that really cared about the other people in the community. She became known as oh my gosh, I can't remember. Everybody referred to her as Grandma Byers, even those who weren't in her family, because she was just a very maternal person. So one of the difficult and most touching parts of writing the novel was the rendering and then renewal of their relationship, because and this was something that I imagined. This is not anything that I had read anything about, because this is a really kind of a personal thing. But I imagined that Elizabeth and Abraham had conflicts over the community, because Elizabeth saw the discontent in her brothers when Abraham didn't. He just wanted them to go along with the plan. So I imagined that in their personal lives that they would have had a fair amount of conflict over this. And so I had to write that in. I felt like I couldn't ignore that. But then I was able to find a point at which they could come back together, and she could forgive him and he could forgive himself for the violence that was done to her brothers. And he, in a way, he saw the light before, you know, later than she did. And he came back around, and that's how I saw them coming back together, that he really gave up his idealistic view when he understood it wasn't really possible, and it wasn't really a caring and compassionate community as it had been constructed.
You mentioned, well, we talked a lot about parlor games, and of course about Eden Waits, and your fourth book that's coming, when will that be coming out?
March 29th.
Okay. And tell us about your third book, because that fourth one you said is about a spy.
Right.
But what's the point of Vanishing about?
The Point of Vanishing is based on the true story of a child prodigy writer named Barbara Follett. Again, this is a real person. All my novels are based on real people. And Barbara Follett was born in 1914. She published her first novel when she was 12 years old to great acclaim. It was a fantasy adventure novel, and it sold very well in the US and even was exported to England and did really well. So she had great promise, and then her life fell apart. And when she was 25 years old, she vanished. And nobody knew what happened to her. In fact, we're still not positive about what happened to her, but in my novel, I conjecture about what I think happened to her.
Okay. Well, that's, like I said, I'm going to order both for the library. That's really, they sound wonderful.
Great. And if anybody is interested, you can sign up for my newsletter on my website, which is MarykaBiaggio.com. And I put out a quarterly newsletter, and I update people on, you know, what I'm writing. I give reading recommendations.
Okay. I'll put that information in the email I'll send to everybody tomorrow with the recording from tonight.
Yeah, and I'm offering a giveaway of the Model Spy to new people who sign up for my newsletter between now and March 29th. So this is the
Ooh.
time to sign up for the newsletter.
Sounds good. Oh, is there any other final comments or questions or anything that anyone wants to volunteer before we close our call tonight? Okay,
Hi
Mary.
there.
I particularly enjoyed your being here and explaining things to us. It was just delightful. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It's really, really nice to be back in the UP.
Yeah. Well, it was wonderful to talk to you, and I really did enjoy your book, and but I just have to tell you, not that you maybe even care, but who I would, have for actors in your, if we made this into a movie,
Yeah.
is so the brother that they took away, at the end with the police and stuff.
Yes.
I could just picture the cop from Stranger Things. I don't know if you're familiar with that show, but there's a really nice cop in there, and he's kind of a big burly guy, but he still didn't look quite like that picture that you showed us.
Oh, interesting. Yeah. Uh-huh.
But I could totally see him, and I think for the main character, for Abraham, I saw Paul Giamatti. He's in so many movies.
That's a good one.
But I think because he's such a convincer, and I don't know. But my mind just kind of went away with your book. Like it was like a movie in my mind. So not all books do that. Thank you.
Cool. Nice to hear.
Yeah. So I just hope others like me will get on and start reading your newsletter. And thank you very much for coming. And somebody out there, as my email switched over to this new account, one of you needs me to send you the May book, Women of the Copper Country. And I don't know who it was. I lost the request. So if it's you, please email me. Because remember, I've got several copies of Women of the Copper Country written by Mary Doria Russell, which we are doing for May. So if anyone needs it, write me your physical address and I will send it to you. And I won't lose it. It's just, with the email switching over it, I know one person's name got lost. Sharon, your stuff went in the mail today. I got you your bookmark and your reader's guide. I did not forget about you, but it was somebody who wanted the book, because I know you have the book.
I have the book.
Okay.
It's a good book. Mary Doria Russell's book is very good. Yeah.
Yeah, it is. I think those people who haven't read it yet are going to enjoy it. It's the Michigan, I can't remember what they call it. The Great Michigan Read, I think. So I got 30 free copies to share with everyone. So
But it's a real page turner. I read it in quite a short time.
I like Maryka's better, but we're not telling Mary that. Okay, everyone. Good night.
You've been watching the UP Notable Books Club, brought to you by the Upper Peninsula Publisher and Authors Association. To join or for more information, please visit us at www.upaa.org or www.upnotable.com.